1967, Central Highlands, Vietnam. The 1st Cavalry Division reports that 50% of their combat strength is down. Not from enemy fire, not from ambushes or booby traps, from malaria. A single species of mosquito had crippled more American soldiers than entire NVA regiments. The Pentagon's response was a military operation with a name that sounds like a joke. Operation Fly Swatter. It wasn't a joke. Over 5 years, the U.S. military would spray 1.76 million liters of insecticide across Vietnam. They would fly more than 1,300 missions at treetop level. 5 crew members would die in a crash during one of those missions. And when it was over, the insects had won. Vietnam's jungle had been perfecting its defenses for 60 million years. Long before American boots touched Vietnamese soil, the ecosystem had evolved into a breeding ground for creatures that thrived on warm blood. Constant temperatures hovering near 90 degrees. Humidity that never dropped below 80%. Standing water in every shell crater, every bomb crater, every footprint pressed into the mud. Triple canopy jungle blocking the sun, creating a permanent twilight where moisture never evaporated and insects multiplied by the billions. The soldiers who arrived in 1965 had trained for combat. They had learned to shoot, to take cover, to call in artillery. Nobody had trained them for this. Private First Class Michaels, 20 years old, drafted out of Ohio, stepped off the helicopter at Pleiku in March 1965 carrying 60 pounds of gear and 0 immunity to tropical disease. The medic who processed him handed over a weekly chloroquine primaquine tablet and told him to take it every Sunday. That was the extent of his protection against an ecosystem that had been killing warm-blooded mammals since before humans existed. Specialist Robert Kramer, 1st Infantry Division, would later describe his arrival. They told us about the VC, about booby traps, about staying alert. Nobody said a damn thing about what was crawling, flying, and biting out there. That's what got you thinking you were losing your mind. Not the enemy you could shoot at, but the million things you couldn't. The problem wasn't ignorance. Military planners knew about tropical diseases. They had studied malaria outbreaks in the Pacific during World War II. They had watched it devastate units in Korea. But Vietnam was different. The Anopheles mosquito that bred in Vietnam's highlands carried Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest malaria parasite. It attacked red blood cells with a ferocity that other strains couldn't match. And unlike the parasites American doctors had studied before, this one was already developing resistance to the drugs designed to kill it. Soldiers like Michael's were walking into a biological trap. Their bodies had no natural defenses. The pills they swallowed every Sunday were fighting an enemy that evolved faster than pharmaceutical companies could adapt. And the military's standard-issue insect repellent, a compound called DEET mixed with other chemicals, worked fine against mosquitoes in Georgia. Against the insects of Vietnam, it was barely an inconvenience. The failure of countermeasures became apparent within months of large-scale deployment. Unit after unit reported the same pattern. Soldiers followed protocol. They took their pills. They applied repellent until their skin burned from the chemicals. They slept under mosquito netting when they could, which wasn't often during combat operations. None of it mattered. Captain Edward Reeves, a medical officer with the 4th Infantry Division, 32 years old, 2 years of residency in tropical medicine that hadn't prepared him for this, watched his aid station fill with shaking, sweating soldiers in the summer of 1966. Evidently, the pills didn't work for everybody, one veteran would later recall, because I remember other guys taking them but still getting sick. Reeves documented what he saw. Fever spikes reaching 104 degrees, soldiers strong enough to hump 60 pounds through jungle, reduced to trembling wrecks who couldn't hold a canteen. Some responded to treatment, others didn't. The drug-resistant strains were already spreading. The brass noticed. They had to. When your combat units are losing men faster to mosquitoes than to enemy contact, it becomes impossible to ignore. Technology and firepower meant nothing against biology. By October 1906, the Department of Defense had authorized a response that acknowledged the scale of the crisis. Operation Fly Swatter would become the largest dedicated anti-insect military campaign in American history. The aircraft were UC-123 Providers, the same planes spraying Agent Orange to strip jungle cover from enemy positions. But these were modified differently. The camouflage paint was stripped off, replaced with bare metal coated in iodine compound, to resist the corrosive effects of malathion insecticide. They looked like silver ghosts flying at treetop level. The missions were dangerous. Herbicide runs lasted 30 minutes, spraying at altitude. Insecticide missions required 2 hours of flying just above the jungle canopy, navigating terrain that could kill a pilot who lost concentration for a second. 14 major bases and their surrounding Vietnamese cities would be sprayed every 9 days, 15,000 acres per sortie, using 8 ounces of insecticide per acre. The math was staggering: 1.76 million liters of malathion over 5 years. More than 1,300 individual missions. Resources that could have supported combat operations diverted to killing bugs. And it wasn't enough. 3 days after a spray mission, mosquito populations returned to previous levels. The jungle kept producing them faster than any aircraft could kill them. Evolution didn't care about military logistics. Insects weren't just annoying, they were winning the war. The soldiers on the ground learned this truth: one fever, one bite, one sleepless night at a time. The brass learned it from casualty reports that made no sense, units losing combat effectiveness without ever engaging the enemy. And the medical officers learned it from aid stations that overflowed with men who had survived firefights only to be laid low by creatures smaller than a fingernail. But mosquitoes were only the beginning. The jungle had more horrors waiting. The most dangerous animal in Vietnam wasn't the tiger. It wasn't the king cobra or the crate. It wasn't the crocodiles in the Mekong Delta or the wild boars that could gore a man to death. The creature that hospitalized more American soldiers than any other weighed approximately 2.5 milligrams. You could fit 40 of them on a single penny. The Anopheles mosquito didn't look like a weapon. It looked like every other mosquito, a fragile thing with translucent wings and spindly legs. But inside its gut lived Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest malaria parasite on Earth. When the mosquito fed, it injected parasites directly into the bloodstream. Within days, those parasites had invaded the liver. Within 2 weeks, they were destroying red blood cells by the millions. The numbers from military medical records read like casualty reports from a major offensive. 65,000 American soldiers hospitalized from malaria during the Vietnam War. That figure comes from Army medical archives, documented cases requiring evacuation from the field to medical facilities. It doesn't include the thousands of soldiers who suffered milder cases and kept fighting. It doesn't include soldiers who were misdiagnosed or never reported symptoms. The Navy and Marines kept their own records: 24,606 malaria cases among naval personnel, 391,965 sick days lost to the disease, 46 confirmed deaths from malarias in the Navy and Marine Corps alone. Army records from 1965 to 1970 show 78 total malaria deaths, averaging 13 men per year killed by mosquito bites. But death wasn't the primary weapon. Incapacitation was. In the Central Highlands, the mountainous jungle region where some of the war's fiercest fighting occurred, malaria casualty rates reached 50% in some units. Half the men in a combat company unable to patrol, unable to fight, unable to do anything except shake with fever and wait for medevac. Unit commanders watched their effective strength dissolve without a single shot fired by the enemy. The parasites evolved faster than the military could respond. Plasmodium falciparum developed resistance to chloroquine, the primary anti-malarial drug, during the war itself. Medical officers who had been successfully treating patients suddenly found their protocols useless. The weekly pills that soldiers had been taking religiously stopped working. Some men took their medication exactly as prescribed and still ended up on stretchers. Jim Manuel served in Vietnam and contracted malaria twice despite taking his prophylaxis pills every week. Years later, the disease would return. Malaria parasites can hide dormant in the liver for decades. He would experience uncontrollable shaking and fever episodes that required hospitalization long after the war ended. "We were always undermanned," he recalled. "Pulmon, so if something happened to you and you needed to get medevaced out of there, there was no one to take your place. It hurt the mission." The mosquitoes didn't coordinate their attacks. They didn't need to. Every swamp, every puddle, every water-filled bomb crater produced thousands more. The high-pitched whine of their wings became the ambient soundtrack of the jungle, a sound that would haunt veterans for decades after they came home. Some still cannot hear a mosquito without their heart rate spiking. Operation FLYSWATTER sprayed millions of liters of insecticide. The mosquitoes returned within days. Medical researchers developed new drug protocols. The parasites evolved around them. The military threw everything it had at an enemy that reproduced faster than it could be killed. The Anopheles mosquito won that war. For 60 million years, the Anopheles had perfected a strategy: feed, breed, adapt. When humans introduced chloroquine, the parasite simply evolved around it. No general planned this. No strategist coordinated it. Evolution doesn't need planning. It only needs time. And the mosquito had time measured in geological epochs, while American soldiers had tours measured in months. The insects of Vietnam weren't just surviving. They were thriving in the chaos humans created. Every bomb crater filled with rain became a new breeding pool. Every firebase carved from jungle created new edges where mosquitoes hunted. The war itself was feeding the enemy it couldn't see, and the mosquito was just the first insect on the list. The soldiers called them communist ants. The nickname wasn't official. It wasn't in any field manual or military briefing. It spread through infantry units the way all soldier slang spreads, born from dark humor and bitter experience. The joke was that these ants only seemed to attack Americans. The Viet Cong moved through the jungle without getting swarmed. American patrols couldn't take 3 steps without disturbing a colony. The truth was simpler and more brutal. Weaponized smaragdina, the Asian weaver ant, attacked anything that threatened its territory. American soldiers, loaded down with gear, moving through unfamiliar terrain, stepped on nests that Vietnamese fighters had learned to avoid since childhood. The ants didn't care about politics. They cared about defending their colonies, and they defended them with a ferocity that made grown men scream. One wrong step was all it took. Weaver ants built their nests by pulling leaves together with silk produced by their larvae. The nests hung in trees and bushes at head height, chest height, waist height. A soldier pushing through dense vegetation might brush against 3 or 4 colonies without seeing any of them. The moment contact was made, hundreds of ants poured out in coordinated waves. They were red, bright, aggressive red, swarming up boots and legs and torsos faster than a man could react. Each ant locked its mandibles into flesh and injected formic acid directly into the wound. The bite felt like a burning cigarette pressed against the skin. One bite was painful. 50 bites at once was overwhelming. 200 bites covering both legs and climbing toward the groin was enough to make combat veterans lose their composure entirely. The Army-issued insect repellent did nothing. DEET and the other compounds in military bug spray had been formulated for North American insects. Against weaver ants, the chemicals might as well have been water. Soldiers watched ants march straight through freshly applied repellent without slowing down. The communist ants' nickname gained another layer of meaning. These insects seemed immune to American technology, just like the enemy they were fighting. Corporal James Miller, 173rd Airborne Brigade, described an encounter near Dak To. "You're ripping at your own clothes in front of your squad, and you don't even care. The burning won't stop. I stripped down to nothing trying to get them off. Guys are laughing until it happens to them. Then they're doing the same thing. The ants don't stop until every one of them has bitten you at least twice." Veteran accounts describe scenes that would be comic if they weren't so desperate. Tank crews who encountered ant swarms inside their vehicles chose to bail out under fire rather than remain trapped with the insects. Soldiers stripped naked in the middle of patrols, slapping and scraping at their own bodies, trying to remove ants that had crawled inside their uniforms and were biting in places no hand could easily reach. The pain lasted for hours. The welts lasted for days. There was no defense except awareness. Learn to spot the nests. Learn to move slowly. Learn to accept that the jungle floor belonged to creatures that had been defending it for millions of years before any human army arrived. The ants attacked in hundreds. They could be survived. The next creature on the list only needed to strike once. 8 inches of nightmare. The Vietnamese giant centipede, Scolopendra subspinipes, looked like something evolution had designed specifically to terrify human beings. A segmented body the color of dried blood. 42 legs that could propel it across jungle floor faster than a man could jump back. 2 modified front legs called forcipules that had evolved into venomous fangs capable of punching through skin like hypodermic needles. This creature hunted at night. It hid during the day in exactly the places soldiers needed to use. Boots left beside cots, bedding rolled up for the night, rucksacks dropped against trees. The ritual of survival became automatic. Shake out your boots, check your sleeping bag. Never reach into a dark space without looking first. One moment of carelessness could mean hours of agony. The bite has been described as liquid fire injected directly into the body. The venom contains a cocktail of compounds designed to incapacitate prey: serotonin, histamine, acetylcholine, and hyaluronidase. Together they trigger immediate intense pain, rapid swelling, and tissue damage that spreads outward from the wound. Victims report a burning sensation that doesn't fade. It intensifies for the first several hours before slowly beginning to subside. Pain from a centipede bite typically lasts 4 to 5 days. Severe cases have lasted longer. Swelling can persist for weeks. In rare cases involving infection or allergic reaction, the bite can kill. Medical literature documents a 7-year-old girl in the Philippines who died 29 hours after being bitten on the head. For soldiers in remote fire bases with limited medical support, the risk of complications was constant. One veteran comparison cut through all the clinical language. "Plan, I've been shot. The centipede was worse." That quote, repeated across multiple veteran accounts in different forms, captures something that statistics cannot. A gunshot wound is violent and terrifying, but it happens in an instant. The pain from a centipede bite builds and builds and refuses to stop. It's not the sharp trauma of combat. It's the slow torture of venom working through tissue hour after hour, while the jungle darkness presses in and the nearest real hospital is a helicopter ride away. The centipedes weren't everywhere, but they didn't need to be. The knowledge that one might be hiding in your boot was enough. The constant vigilance required, checking, shaking, inspecting every piece of gear before use, added another layer of psychological weight to soldiers already carrying more than they could bear. Sleep came harder when you knew what might be crawling toward your warmth in the darkness. Some soldiers saw them clearly in daylight, frozen for a moment before the creature disappeared into undergrowth. 8 inches of armored predator moving with alien speed. The image stayed with men long after they left Vietnam. If the centipede didn't find you, its larger cousin was waiting in the same hiding places. Field Medical Report, 4th Infantry Division, Central Highlands, June 1967. Medical Officer, CPT Edward Reeves, MC Subject, Scorpion Envenomation Cases. Monthly Summary. Documented incidents, 23 cases, up 340% from March baseline of 5 cases. Species identified: Heterometrus lyoticus, Vietnamese giant forest scorpion. Average specimen length, 11 to 12 centimeters. Several specimens collected for verification exceeded 13 centimeters. Largest arachnid encounters reported by personnel. Common scenarios: boot intrusion, 61%, rucksack shelter seeking, 22%, foxhole occupation, 13%, miscellaneous, 4%. Clinical presentation: immediate localized pain, 100% of cases, muscle spasms radiating from sting site, 87%, inflammation and edema lasting 6 to 72 hours, 100%, nausea and dizziness, 35%, elevated heart rate, 48%. Treatment protocol: pain management, antihistamine administration, observation for systemic reaction. No fatalities. 2 cases required medevac due to severe systemic symptoms and pre-existing cardiac conditions. Preventive measures reinforced: daily gear inspection, mandatory boot shaking protocol, foxhole sweeps before occupation. Note: Heterometrus lyoticus venom demonstrates relatively low acute toxicity compared to other scorpion species per published literature. However, psychological impact on unit morale remains significant. Personnel report fear of equipment use, sleep disruption, and constant hypervigilance. The size of specimens encountered, some approaching 5 inches in length, creates disproportionate stress response relative to actual medical danger. Most soldiers had never seen a scorpion larger than a few inches. The Vietnamese giant forest scorpion shattered that frame of reference. Pincers that could span a man's palm, a tail that curled overhead like a loaded weapon. In the dim light of a hooch, or the total darkness of a jungle position, encountering something that large and that alien triggered responses that went deeper than training. Pure primal fear. The "shake out your boots" mantra became religious doctrine. These creatures were ambush predators that waited in dark, confined spaces until something warm came close enough to grab. A boot left on the ground overnight was an invitation. Every piece of gear became a potential ambush site. The good news, if it could be called that, was that the venom rarely killed healthy adults. The bad news was that rarely fatal meant nothing to a soldier convulsing in a foxhole at 3 in the morning, wondering if his throat was going to swell shut before dawn. Every solution failed against evolution. The military could spray insecticide, they could issue repellents, they could distribute anti-malarial drugs. None of it addressed the fundamental problem. These creatures had evolved over millions of years to survive in exactly this environment. They weren't invading American positions, Americans were invading theirs. The ground and the air both belonged to swarms. Fire ants lived in the ground itself, invisible until disturbed. Hornets and wasps owned the air and vegetation, dormant until provoked. Together they created a two-front assault that turned every step and every movement into calculated risk. You couldn't see fire ants coming. Their mounds looked like every other patch of disturbed earth, in a jungle where everything was disturbed earth. A soldier could walk across a dozen nests without knowing it. The 101st would teach him. The attack began the moment weight pressed down on a colony. Thousands of workers pouring out simultaneously, swarming up legs, each ant capable of stinging multiple times. The stings created raised white pustules surrounded by red inflammation. Dozens of them, clustered so close together, they merged into continuous bands of burning skin. For most soldiers, the pain meant hours of discomfort. But allergic reactions changed the math entirely. Anaphylaxis could close a man's airway within minutes. In the field, far from any hospital, a severe allergic reaction became a medical emergency with no good solutions. Hornets and wasps attacked from above, and the Viet Cong knew it. Asian giant hornets and their relatives grew to nearly 2 inches long. Their stingers could penetrate clothing that would stop smaller species. The venom they injected attacked tissue at the cellular level, destroying red blood cells and triggering massive inflammatory responses. A single sting was agonizing. Multiple stings could be fatal even without an allergic reaction. The enemy weaponized them. Viet Cong fighters collected hornet nests and relocated them to trails American patrols were likely to use. They positioned them at choke points where men would have to pass single file. Some nests were simply left in place, natural booby traps waiting to be triggered. Others were rigged with small explosive charges, a detonation that shattered the nest and sent furious hornets in every direction at the same moment the patrol was already diving for cover. Private First Class Danny Morrison, 1st Cavalry Division, encountered a rigged nest near Anqui in August 1968. The explosion wasn't much, just enough to blow the nest apart. Then you're hearing this sound, like a chainsaw getting louder, hundreds of them coming at once. Henderson got stung maybe 15, 20 times before we even knew what was happening. His face swelled up so bad we couldn't see his eyes. Medic had to hit him with epinephrine right there on the trail. We thought we were going to watch him die from fucking hornets. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical damage. The jungle itself seemed to attack American soldiers. Every shadow might hide an ambush. Every branch might conceal a nest. The constant vigilance required to survive drained men faster than the march itself. Nowhere was safe. The ground belonged to fire ants. The air belonged to hornets. And inside soldiers' own bodies, another invasion was waiting to begin. Something was moving under his skin. That realization, felt rather than seen, a squirming pressure beneath the surface of a wound that should have been healing, marked the moment many soldiers understood that Vietnam's jungle would find ways inside them that no enemy bullet could. Bot flies and flesh flies had evolved a reproductive strategy that seemed designed by horror writers. Adult flies didn't bite. They didn't need to. They deposited eggs near wounds, in exposed flesh, sometimes on mosquitoes that would carry the eggs to a warm-blooded host. When the larvae hatched, they burrowed. The medical term was myiasis, infestation of living tissue by fly larvae. The experience was something clinical language couldn't capture. The larvae needed warmth and protein to grow. Human tissue provided both. They anchored themselves with tiny hooks, feeding on dead cells at first, then living tissue as they grew larger. A soldier might notice increased drainage from a wound, unexpected pain, the sense that something was wrong in a way he couldn't explain. The first visual confirmation, seeing a larva move beneath the skin, or watching one emerge partially from a wound before retreating, broke something in men that combat hadn't touched. Sergeant Michael Torres, 101st Airborne, described his extraction at a field hospital near Phu Bai. The medic told me not to look. I looked anyway. He's got forceps and he's waiting. Then this thing starts coming out of my arm. White, segmented, moving. He grabbed it and pulled. I felt it resist, like it was holding on from inside. When it finally came out, it was maybe an inch long. He dropped it in a dish and it kept moving. I watched it curl up and I wanted to vomit. That thing had been inside me for days. Extraction was its own nightmare. The larvae resisted removal. Their hooked bodies gripped tissue and held on. Medics learned techniques, covering the wound to cut off air supply, forcing the larva to surface for oxygen, then grabbing it with forceps before it could retreat. The process was painful. It was degrading. And it didn't always work on the first attempt. Infection risk multiplied with every hour, larvae remained embedded. In tropical conditions, wounds that might have healed cleanly became breeding grounds for bacteria. Tissue damage spread beyond what the larvae themselves caused. Some soldiers required surgical debridement, cutting away infected flesh to prevent worse outcomes. The psychological toll outlasted the physical wounds. Being eaten alive, slowly, from the inside, violated something fundamental about bodily autonomy. Soldiers could accept being shot at. They could process the risk of stepping on a mine. But the idea that their own flesh had become a host for parasites, that the jungle had found a way to colonize their bodies, created a horror that didn't fade when the larvae were removed. Some captured American pews, denied medical care, reportedly used maggots therapeutically, allowing fly larvae to clean dead tissue from wounds that would otherwise have killed them. Desperation transforming horror into survival tool. The jungle's logic imposed on men who had no other options. By 1967, the insects had achieved what the Viet Cong often couldn't: total combat ineffectiveness in some American units. Firebase Henderson, Central Highlands, September 1967. Captain Marcus Webb had been in country for 7 months, long enough to know what incoming mortars sounded like, long enough to recognize the difference between harassing fire and a real assault, long enough to understand that the jungle killed men in ways that didn't make the evening news back home. He commanded a rifle company, 147 men on paper, closer to 130 in practice after rotations, injuries, and the normal attrition of war. They held a firebase carved out of triple canopy jungle, a patch of red clay surrounded by walls of green that pressed in from every direction. The perimeter wire was solid, the artillery support was reliable, the men were experienced. None of it mattered against what was coming. Private Rodriguez reported to the aid station on a Tuesday morning, complaining of headache and chills. The medic took his temperature, 101.2, gave him aspirin and told him to hydrate, probably just the crud that cycled through every fire base. Nothing to worry about. By Thursday, 4 more men had reported similar symptoms: headache, chills, fatigue that went beyond normal exhaustion. Rodriguez was worse. His fever had climbed to 102.8. He complained of pain behind his eyes, muscle aches that made him wince when he moved. The medics started paying closer attention. By Sunday, 11 soldiers were running fevers. 3 of them couldn't stand without support. Rodriguez, the first case, had stopped sweating despite a temperature that had climbed to 103.8. His skin was hot and dry to the touch. His eyes had taken on a glassy quality that the medic had seen before. He radioed Captain Webb with 2 words: malaria outbreak. The confirmation came from blood smears examined under a field microscope. Plasmodium falciparum, the bad one, the one that killed. Webb requested medical evacuation for the worst cases. 3 helicopters arrived over 2 days, carrying out 7 soldiers too sick to function. The anti-malarial drugs and the aid station's supplies were distributed to everyone showing symptoms: chloroquine, primaquine, the standard protocol that had worked in previous outbreaks. It wasn't working now. New cases appeared faster than the drugs could suppress them. 15 men down by the end of the first week, 23 by day 10. The aid station, designed to handle combat injuries, not epidemic disease, filled beyond capacity. Soldiers lay on stretchers outside the tent, shaking under poncho liners in 90-degree heat. Lieutenant Peters, Webb's executive officer, ran the numbers. They had started the month with 131 effective soldiers. They now had 108, and the infection rate was accelerating. "It's the resistant strain," the medic told Webb. "Some of these guys aren't responding to treatment at all. The parasites are eating the drugs and asking for seconds." Webb looked at the perimeter. His men were spread thin, covering positions that should have had twice the manpower. If the enemy probed tonight, they'd find gaps. The fever takes hold like a fist closing around the brain. Private First Class, Danny Morrison wakes in darkness, unsure if it's night or if something has gone wrong with his vision. His body is shaking, not trembling, shaking, violent spasms that rattle the cot beneath him and make his teeth click together hard enough to chip enamel. He is cold, colder than he has ever been in his life. The thermometer the medic pressed under his tongue 20 minutes ago read 104.1 degrees. He is burning alive and freezing to death at the same time. The sounds of the aid station wash over him in waves. Other men moaning. Someone calling for water in a voice that has gone raspy and thin. The medic moving between cots, checking pulses, checking pupils, checking to see who has gotten worse since the last round. Outside, the high-pitched whine of mosquitoes. Always the mosquitoes. They are still feeding, still breeding, still winning. Morrison tries to remember the last time he felt normal. A week ago, 2 weeks. Time has become unreliable. He remembers walking patrol. He remembers the jungle pressing in, green walls that seem to breathe. He remembers slapping at his neck, feeling the wet smear of crushed insect in his own blood. He didn't think anything of it. Everyone got bitten. Everyone. Now he understands. That mosquito, or one just like it, carried something inside him, something that has been multiplying in his liver, in his blood, eating him from the inside the way the botfly larvae eat from the inside. The enemy is already past the wire. The enemy is already inside the firebase. The enemy is inside him. Captain Webb stands at the entrance to the aid station, watching his company dissolve. 53 men are now too sick to patrol. 53 out of 131. 40% of his effective strength gone without a single shot fired by the enemy. The perimeter is a skeleton. He has pulled men from rest rotations, extended shifts, consolidated positions. It isn't enough. The radio crackles with a request from battalion. They want a patrol to check a suspected enemy staging area 3 clicks north. Webb looks at the request, looks at the aid station, looks at the map showing how thin his lines have become. He keys the radio, and unable to comply. Combat ineffective due to disease casualties. The words taste like ash in his mouth. An American infantry company, equipped with the most advanced weapons on Earth, backed by artillery and air support and medevac helicopters, has been rendered combat ineffective by an insect. Biology doesn't care about military strategy. The silver aircraft appear on Thursday morning. UC-123 providers, stripped of camouflage paint, gleaming in the early sunlight like strange birds from another world. Operation Fly Swatter. Webb watches them bank over the firebase, watches the mist trail behind them, watches the malathion settle over jungle canopy and perimeter wire, an aid station, and everything else within 15,000 acres. The smell hits 10 minutes later, chemical, sharp, the kind of smell that makes you wonder what it's doing to your lungs while it's killing the mosquitoes. The men who can still stand watch the aircraft make their passes. Someone jokes that they're finally getting air support that might actually help. Someone else doesn't laugh. The fever patients don't react at all. They're beyond caring about aircraft or chemicals or anything except the war being fought inside their own bodies. By Friday, Webb has 61 men in the aid station or awaiting medevac. He has 70 men still functional, some of them barely, running low-grade fevers but refusing to report sick because they know the alternative is abandoning their brothers on the line. On Saturday, the medevac helicopters arrive in force. Medical evacuation of 34 soldiers in a single day. Battalion has finally acknowledged what Webb reported a week ago. Firebase Henderson is combat ineffective. They are being reinforced by another company while the sick are evacuated. On Sunday, 3 days after the spray mission, Webb walks the perimeter at dusk. The mosquitoes are back, not reduced, not diminished. Back at full strength, rising from every puddle and shell crater and patch of standing water that the insecticide couldn't reach. The high-pitched whine fills the air as the sun drops below the tree line. The mosquitoes rising from the crater don't know they're winning a war. They only know warmth, blood. The next generation. They've been doing this for 60 million years. They'll be doing it for 60 million more. Webb slaps at his neck, feels the familiar wet smear, looks at his palm in the fading light. His company has lost half its strength. 5 years of Operation FLYSWATTER have sprayed 1.76 million liters of chemicals across South Vietnam. Medical researchers have developed new drug protocols and watched the parasites evolve around them. The Pentagon has thrown billions of dollars at an enemy that weighs less than a grain of rice. The mosquitoes don't care. They have been breeding in this jungle for epochs that dwarf human history. They will be breeding here long after the last American soldier has gone home. Webb watches the medevac helicopters lift off, carrying men who survived firefights and ambushes only to be laid low by insect bites. He thinks about the letter he will have to write to battalion, explaining how a rifle company became combat ineffective without ever engaging the enemy. He thinks about the letters those sick men will carry home, the malaria parasites dormant in their livers, waiting years or decades to resurface. The insects won this battle. They are winning the war. And there is nothing, not aircraft, not chemicals, not military strategy, that can stop them. Operation FLYSWATTER flew its last mission in December 1971. Over 5 years, the program had sprayed 1.76 million liters of malathion insecticide across South Vietnam. More than 1,300 individual sorties, 14 major bases and their surrounding cities treated every 9 days. 15,000 acres per mission, 5 crew members dead in a single crash near Phan Rang Air Base in February of that final year. Americans killed fighting insects. The official assessment called the operation a success. Malaria rates had declined from their peak. The program had demonstrated the military's commitment to force protection. Resources had been allocated and expended according to plan. The men who had served knew a different truth. The mosquitoes never stopped. The ants never stopped. The centipedes and scorpions kept hiding in boots that soldiers kept shaking out every morning. The jungle had been producing these creatures for 60 million years before Operation FLYSWATTER began. It continued producing them without interruption after the last UC-123 returned to base. The war against insects couldn't be won. It could only be endured. For thousands of soldiers, the endurance continued long after they came home. Malaria parasites can survive dormant in the human liver for decades. Plasmodium vivax, one of the strains endemic to Vietnam, specializes in this trick, hiding in liver cells, waiting, then erupting back into the bloodstream years or even decades after the initial infection. Veterans who thought they had recovered found themselves shaking with fever in American hospitals, fighting a war that had followed them home. Jim Manuel contracted malaria twice during his service despite taking his prophylaxis pills religiously. The disease returned years later, sending him back to hospitals with symptoms that doctors initially struggled to explain. Uncontrollable shaking, fever spikes, the same pattern he had experienced in the jungle, replaying in peacetime. He wasn't alone. The VA eventually recognized malaria as a service-connected condition for Vietnam veterans, acknowledging that the parasites many soldiers carried home were as much a consequence of their service as any wound from enemy fire. Some wounds don't show on the body. Sergeant David Chen, 25th Infantry Division, described his return home in 1970. I'd be sitting in my apartment in San Diego and I'd hear it, that high-pitched whine. Just a regular mosquito, probably harmless, but my heart would start pounding. I'd be sweating. 20 seconds and I'm back in the jungle at night, waiting for something to bite me, waiting to get sick. It took years before I could sleep with the windows open. Veterans reported psychological responses to insect encounters that persisted for decades. The high-pitched whine of a mosquito could trigger elevated heart rate, sweating, a flood of memories from jungles half a world away. The sight of ants swarming could induce anxiety responses that made no logical sense in suburban backyards. The mind had learned to fear these creatures at a level deeper than conscious thought, and that learning didn't fade just because the jungle was thousands of miles away. The insects of Vietnam had achieved something remarkable in military terms. They had degraded combat effectiveness, consumed resources, killed soldiers, and created casualties that would continue accumulating for decades after the last helicopter left Saigon. They had done this without strategy, without coordination, without any awareness that a war was being fought at all. They had simply existed, as they had always existed, as they would continue to exist. And that existence had been enough to humble the most powerful military on Earth. You cannot bomb insects into submission. You cannot shoot them into retreat. You cannot negotiate with biology or intimidate evolution. The smallest enemy was the one they couldn't defeat. The soldiers who served in Vietnam carried many things home with them: memories, trauma, pride in their service, and questions about its purpose. Some carried shrapnel in their bodies or damage to their lungs from Agent Orange exposure. And some carried parasites in their blood, organisms that had found a way inside them and refused to leave. The jungle's final claim on men who thought they had escaped. The insects of Vietnam didn't care about politics or policy. They didn't know they were fighting a war. They simply did what 60 million years of evolution had designed them to do. They bred, they fed, they survived. In the end, that was enough to win. The insects of Vietnam weren't the only environmental threat American soldiers faced. If you found this valuable, please like and share. Subscribe for more reality-based Vietnam War content. Everything discussed here comes from military medical records, Operation FLYSWATTER archives, and veteran testimony. Check the description for sources. Thank you for watching.